Hello and welcome to the 5th edition of Cineclub Película, in which we discuss classic Spanish films from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Cineclub Película is online as a project of Instituto Cervantes Manila and the Spanish Embassy. Every weekend of July, we have shown for free important Spanish films from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So joining us for this discussion, our last of the cycle, is Patrick Campos, film scholar and educator of the UP Film Institute and author of The End of National Cinema. Patrick?
Hello. Hello, good afternoon. Excited to chika.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. And then Isa Lorenzo, the artist and gallerist, founder of Silver Lens Gallery. Isa?
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. When do you think we can go to Silver Lens again?
Well, we're open by appointment.
Ah, okay. So we can go where we have to. Okay, next, joining us also is filmmaker Pam Miras, writer, director, and cinematographer whose works include Pascalina and Blood Bank. Pam?
Hi. Thanks for inviting
Hi, Pam.
me.
Yes.
Yeah, and just to clarify, I didn't do cinematography for Pascalina and Blood Bank. I just wrote.
Yeah, but you know, but I mentioned that you also do cinematography, so yeah. Okay, so also joining us from Leon in Spain is Kristine Guzmán, architect and curator at MUSAC, the Museum of Contemporary Arts in Castile and Leon. Hi, Kristine.
Hello, good afternoon, and buenos dias to all in Spain.
Yes, welcome to the 5th and last session of Cineclub Película. Now, our last movie in this cycle is La Vaquilla, or The Heifer, the first comedy film about the Spanish Civil War made in Spain, although not by any means the first film about the Spanish Civil War. It is a collaboration of two giants of Spanish cinema, the director Luis García Berlanga, whose films Welcome Mr. Marshall and El Verdugo may be familiar to you from an earlier cycle of Classics with You. He is also the director of Plácido. Interesting to note that his father was a Republican who was executed by Franco's soldiers. And then in all the time that he worked during the Franco dictatorship, he was able to outwit the censors who allowed his films to be exhibited to great success in Spain and in international film festivals. And then his collaborator here is the screenwriter Rafael Azcona, who is also a novelist. His films include the Italian film Mafioso by Alberto Latuada, Peppermint Frappe by Carlos Saura, and Belle Epoque by Fernando Trueba, which was actually a big hit in the Philippines in the 1990s. Now, briefly, the film is about the war on the Aragon Front, where Republican soldiers, the left-wing army loyal to the duly elected socialist government, hear an announcement that the nationalist soldiers, the right-wing army loyal to Francisco Franco, are having a fiesta with a bullfight and a bull run. So as the Republicans are running low on food, they decide to sell a group of soldiers to send a group of soldiers to the village to steal the bull and demoralize the nationalists. Now, all this talk of Republicans, loyalists, and nationalists can get confusing, so I'd like to ask Kristine in Spain to give us a potted summary of the Spanish Civil War. Kristine?
Okay, I will try to give a summary because to talk about the Civil War is quite a very long topic. So I would like to start in 1898, which is a year that most of our kababayans can relate to, because as you know, 1898 was the year when Spain lost the last of its colonies. They call it the Desastre del 98, the disaster of 98, because at that time, Spain realized that it was not a world power anymore. So it provoked a profound crisis in the national conscience. And in that time, Spain was a constitutional monarchy. As you know, we were under Alfonso XIII, but he did not rule yet because he was a minor. But there was an attempt to convert Spain into a republic a few decades earlier, which did not really succeed. So when Alfonso XIII acceded the throne, his popularity, the popularity of the monarchy, was already declining, such that in the 1920s to the 1930s, there was a dictatorship under Primo de Rivera. This military dictatorship was backed by Alfonso XIII, so his popularity was declining even more. And there was a lot of discontent, so King Alfonso XIII gave in to popular pressure, and he called for municipal elections. In those elections, which happened in April of 1931, the Republicans, together with some left-wing parties in coalition, they obtained majority in almost all provincial capitals. So that marked the establishment of the Second Republic. Initially, the Republic had broad support from society, but there was violence. It reinforced the idea that the Republic was determined to persecute the church, because it was usually the church who were the victims of these violence. There were several strikes from the labor unions, and many thought that the Second Republic was just as oppressive as the monarchy. So a few months later, in June 1931, there were another elections, and this resulted to a Republican socialist government. This new government, they wanted to modernize Spain by introducing new reforms. Most of these reforms were related to agriculture, land reforms, redistribution of land, and it displeased many landowners because they were only a minority, and most of the people were agricultural workers or laborers. And then a new constitution was drafted, and it reinforced a secularization of the country, which meant that church properties were confiscated, Catholic schools were abolished, the military was reduced, Catalonia was granted its own local parliament. So all of these changes caused the government enemies, such that in 1933, there were elections again. And in these elections, it was the rightists who won this time. And they derogated all the reforms of the previous government. The years after this were considered the Black 2 years because it was quite complicated. It was a period when there were many strikes in major cities in Madrid and Barcelona and also in Asturias. And these rebellions were crushed by the Navy. So in 1936, there were elections again, and this time it was the Frente Popular who won. The Frente Popular is a coalition of the left, and they promised more reforms. But the situation at this time was really, really chaotic, and there were also conflicts, internal conflicts within the Frente Popular. So what actually triggered the civil war were a series of assassinations. First, it was the socialist Jose Castillo, who was assassinated by the rightists. And then in vengeance, the leftists assassinated the opposition leader, Calvo Sotelo. So the generals, the Mola, Franco, and Sanjurjo, they were secretly trying to make a coup. They were planning a coup against the Republic. And when these assassinations took place, it was actually what triggered them to do the coup. So initially, their idea was to implement a military dictatorship, but then go on to make a conservative republic. But the rebellion was crushed in the major cities, Madrid and Barcelona and in Valencia. So they didn't expect that there would be a confrontation, and that led to the civil war. So I hope I was able to give a summary more or less. It is actually more complicated.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the background. I realized how complicated this is, and it's noteworthy that in the film, the motivations, the objectives of the two sides are not discussed, although both are equally mocked. Although you get a clear idea which side the film is on. So let's talk about the film itself and our reactions to it. I'd like to start with Pam, the filmmaker. What did you think of the film?
This is my first time actually to see a film by Berlanga, and I just watched it without reading about it first, and I was surprised that it was a comedy, and I really enjoyed it. And I agree with what you said, that both sides were equally mocked. It was a satire on war, and I like that it presented war in that light. And it really, I enjoyed it because it really helped me uh, see this the other side of what what Kristine described, what's written in history books, seeing how these people lived and the reality of their world then. And it's actually it's a fitting thing to watch during these times, because as they say, I think there's a saying that obstacles create desperation and desperation creates comedy. So, you know, watching it during these desperate times, I mean, it sort of echoes that feeling that things are really crazy, and sometimes we have no other recourse but to just laugh about
Laugh.
it. I guess.
Yes, of course, laughter has always been our armor throughout contemporary Philippine history. But
Yeah.
I found interesting how in the movie, um, both sides are constantly being reminded of how they're just the same, and no one is particularly super fanatical about the side they're on. So it makes for a lot of comedy. So Pam, do you think that the film is on the side of the Republicans on the left or the nationalists on the right?
It's easy. At the start, you'd think, because we saw the film from the point of view of the Republicans, so we saw it from their point of view, and they actually have a goal in the film. We're navigating the story through their eyes, hearing about the fiesta and hatching a plan to ruin that, and planning a heist to get the bull, and when they were trapped, planning a way to get out. And so we see it through their eyes, but it's really not about it's not really sympathetic to their side or their ideology. I think it's sympathetic really to the side of the victims of the war, specifically the poor
Right.
bull. You know.
Yes, and you bring up the bull, which is interesting because the bull has always been a symbol of Spain, and so of course the bull in the movie turns out to be a heifer, and then the fact that it takes place during a fiesta which they plan to disrupt immediately made me think of Pinoys and how everything will stop for a fiesta. But Isa, what do you think of the film?
I really enjoyed it. Like Pam, I entered it not reading anything about it. I was expecting something else. So I was pleasantly surprised. I kept thinking of Dolphy.
Yes.
Or Monty Python, or all of these comedy skits, movies that are one continuous comedy skit after another, and
Yes.
very, very much up the alley of John and Marcia.
Yes.
I thought the writing was very good. I kept thinking that this culturally is very much where we came from as Filipinos. Also, it was funny how all the scenes rolled into our own cultural cliches. You know, the whorehouse and the church and the rich person who owns the land, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought it was very, very universal.
Yes, despite it being specifically Spanish, in
Yeah.
many ways it's very Pinoy. It should be very universal. Kristine,
Yes, yes.
what did you think?
Oh, I love the team up of Berlanga and Ascona because I think the combination of their screenwriting is very intelligent. They were able to make something witty and fresh from a very painful episode in history. You wouldn't expect that you can make a comedy out of something as serious as the Civil War. And it didn't need a lot of words or scenes to explain much of the Civil War. Actually, they explained it in the first scene and when they were trading the cigarettes, and Brigada Castro said that, you know, this is the two Spains. So with only a few words and a few scenes, they were able to portray many things about the life in Spain during that time. They didn't say which ideology was better. They weren't siding on anyone. But I think Berlanga also wanted to refute the belief that there were ideologies in certain regions, because the truth of the matter is that many people were just caught in the war. They weren't really siding with one side or another. It just happened, and they were caught in that moment and in that time. And some of them didn't have any choice whether to admit or I think even the family, you know, Juana and Guadalupe, I think they were actually Republicans, but because the father was a Republican, but they couldn't say it outrightly. So it happened to many people in Spain during that time. So the movie was like a portrait of Spain, a portrait of that period. And it showed that there weren't any good guys or bad guys from both sides. They were just people. Everyone was equal. So I like the way they portrayed the film in that way.
Yes, and as Kristine pointed out, it would seem that such a painful episode in history would not become the subject of a comic film. And yet, if you have to deal with the absurdity of the entire situation and how in the confusion and the fact that a lot of people are dragged into it whether they want to be or not, makes it also the perfect material for comedy. Patrick, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. No? So I found it very interesting, and since last night I've thought about it, but looking at it from different contexts. No? So the first context that I'm looking at it is this war plus comedy idea, right? So I agree with you, Jessica, when you said that it's so absurd that it's also a perfect a vehicle for a comedy. So parang since the Aristophanes, right? So if something is so crazy, it can be funny, and war can be really great. War is the ultimate insanity, and so
It's the
it
ultimate
is,
in cray.
yeah, right. And it's the challenge for a comic writer to take on the most absurd situation. So I saw it as part of that kind of history of comedies dealing with the war and its absurdity, like MASH and Catch 22. And if you look at it from that point, we see how I agree with Pam, no, that it sort of takes the side of the victims of the war. It ends with that image, right, of the vultures and the dead bull, right, and it's the bull, and the people who are victims of this war that this film is trying to depict. But at the same time, I found it interesting that it's a film about the Civil War as well. So it's not just a generic war, but also the Spanish Civil War, which is also very pregnant with a lot of contestation, right, about how to represent it. So like I think that the part where we talk about the specificity of the war is the one where most Filipinos, I guess, can relate. Like how should we remember a dictatorship, or how should we remember a war? Is a very important question. So I'm sort of like there's a push and pull about my feelings about the film. On one hand, as a film about war, I find it really, really important in its universal message. But at the same time, in a film about the Spanish Civil War, I find it a little bit problematic. And I hope we can discuss that later. No? But those are my two contexts of appreciating the film.
Interesting. Problematic in what respect?
Okay, so sige, yun na, punta na tayo doon. So I think this notion of again, let me qualify. No? So if it's a film about the absurdity or the evils or the darkness of war, then I think it's an important testament to that. No? But the question of which side must the filmmaker take? I think it's a very important question that you raised earlier, Jessica. No? I did think, and agreeing with Pam, no, that the film did sort of have can be tipped toward siding with the Republicans because they follow the story of the Republicans, and also in the main premise is that they're hungry, right? So the nationalists are hypocrites and living a luxurious and comfortable life, and the Republicans are sort of hypocrites but they're hungry. So in a way you side with the underdog. But I'm thinking in terms of like if this is the first comedy about the Spanish Civil War, and it contributes to the discourse of how should we remember the Spanish Civil War, how should we remember Franco, etc. Then I sort of think it should have taken a clearer side, or maybe because I'm guessing that the context of showing it was shown to a generation that did not live through the war, did not live to see the war. So it sort of clouds your memory about, was the war just absurd, or was there really a point to the war, right? So and I think when we look back, we really need to remember that there was a point in certain conflicts. Maybe the entire war was insane, but we need to remember it. And in Spain, we will get to see people struggling with remembering the war. So I thought, but this is me in retrospect, right? I mean, looking at it in retrospect, I mean, Berlanga in the 80s maybe had something else in mind. But now in 2020, I think trying to remember from a particular side is very important. Lalo na, Philippines, Spain, right?
Very interesting point, especially since a lot of subjects in recent Philippine history, I feel, are too soon to talk about. And, we don't quite know how to deal with them because it's still an ongoing issue. But to your knowledge, have there been any comedies about war made in the Philippines? I know that there are funny parts in Oro Plata Mata, but that's all I can think of.
I mean, ganito kami noon, paano kayo ngayon is essentially a comedy, right? True. So it's a Philippine-American war in Spanish. So that would be the main, I think that would be on top of my head as a best example
Eddie Romero, yes.
Yeah, of comedy and war, but also takes a clear side regarding the war. Yeah.
Yes. And so in the film, of course, the overriding symbol here is the bull, which is also the symbol of Spain. So that in the last shot where you see the bull being picked on by vultures, it's very clear what the director is saying. But I'd like to ask Kristine, because in the news, we constantly hear of the ongoing reckoning with the civil war in Spain. As in, there are a lot of exhumations of victims of the Civil War. And then there's this ongoing discussion about what to do with a gigantic monument to Francisco Franco. So, Kristine, where does it stand now? Well, of course, everything is at a standstill at the moment because of the pandemic. But, Kristine, how is the reckoning with the Civil War continuing in Spain?
Okay. As you know, after the Civil War, there was what we call the Pact of Oblivion, or the Pact of Forgetting. So the major political parties made an agreement that they will attempt to put all the past behind them and try to move on in order to ensure a smooth transition to democracy. And this pact meant that in Spain there would be no accountability for the thousands of people who died during the war.
Yeah, but beginning in the 90s, as in the grandchildren of the people who were just taken away and shot in the dead of night have been asking what happened to our grandparents? Why don't they even have graves? So how is that proceeding right now? And one hears about all these exhumations of mass graves. I don't think they even find the grave of, they've even found where Lorca is buried, no?
Yeah, that's true. Actually, in 2007, there was a law of historical memories. So this was done during the socialist period of Zapatero. So this was a law which allowed to the families to look for the graves of their families. It was actually very controversial, and it still is very controversial to this day, because I think the pact of oblivion meant that people couldn't talk about it, but they had pain inside of them, and they needed to, look for answers, and they needed to find out where their loved ones were. They needed to deal with the pain in a certain way. So as of now, it's still very controversial. The exhumation of Franco's body was a really big controversy here last year. And so I think that's why there are many films about the Civil War, because people need to know how to deal with their past. They need answers.
Some sort of closure, kumbaga.
Yes.
And so, yes,
I'd like to ask Kristine, actually, if what do you think is the pulse of like the people on the ground about remembering the war or the Franco years? Are people, do people want to remember? Is it something that's very important these days, or have people forgotten?
Well, people want to get rid of everything that's related to Franco. Actually, many statues or streets of names that are named after militaries of Franco, they were all taken out. All the reminders in public statues, public monuments, they were all torn down. So this was like a healing process also for the people. And part of the healing process is to be able to dig up those graves, to be able to know where their families were, what happened to them. So I think it's very important. And I think the general pulse is that people, yes, they need an answer.
Yes, I'd like to talk more about the movie as a comedy and what exactly makes it work. I noticed, I first time I watched it, I saw that the star is Alfredo Landa, who was also the protagonist in The Holy Innocents, which was shown 3 weeks ago. And he's a wonderful comic actor, and you can see how comic timing is essential to how this film works. But Isa, can you are there specific scenes which you remember from The Heifer?
I think to start with the bathing scene, wherein they all end up swimming in the same spring.
Yes, and you don't need to look far to notice the symbolism there.
Yes. I also thought that not a specific scene, but this idea of cutting hair.
Yes.
that was such a big punishment, to shave off their head. So, throughout the movie, Mariano has like a reverse mohawk, with his head, with his hair. And I thought that was really funny. And it also points to that the whole situation is completely out of whack, unfinished, and out of any sensibility. And the fact that he kept it, he kept his reverse mohawk the whole time, even if they had a clipper. Someone had a clipper there. So I thought that those two elements were really funny.
Yes, and Pam, what was your favorite scene in the film?
my I don't really have a, like a favorite. I think maybe the last scene in the film is what the film left you with. It's like after like 2 hours of laughing, and then you see this dead cow being picked apart by carrions. It's jarring. Also the ending, and to give it away, it's how things were resolved basically. But I also found the device of, like what Isa said, um, shaving one's hair. Watching that, I realized that maybe that's where our lolos and lolas got this, where they got the threat of like, if you do this, I'll shave your head or kakalbuhin kita. Pag, ano, I think that's where it started, because why would I, so maybe it was done by Spaniards before when we were a colony of Spain. Maybe that was that's a thing in Spain, shaving one's hair. I don't know. So I don't know. Maybe some of you can clarify.
There's a relation to Samson and his hair. So there's a biblical backstory, diba? Because once Samson's hair was removed, he lost his strength, or he became blind or something. So knowing our penchant for all these biblical threats, or threats that come from biblical stories, that might be so it.
It's a Catholic thing.
Yes.
Ako naman, I think it's connected to other war films where the hair is important, like mga Full Metal Jacket, or where the young people, they're afraid to mess their hair, but they have to go to war, so they have to shave their head. So
yeah.
I remember 2 or 3 war films where the hair of the young people are very important. So if you mess it like that, right? So it's crazy. As Isa was saying, so it's the whole film, his hair was like that. So it's crazy.
And then parang at first I thought the comedy was kinda slapstick, but I mean it's very physical, toilet humor, jokes about poop and whatever. But I guess it's, I don't know if it was this, maybe, I don't know, Patrick or whoever could answer, but I don't know if it's a style popularized by the filmmaker or the writer, or is it because it was made in the 80s and it was a sort of like the comedy that was popular with the masses, same as with the Philippines in the 80s.
I think
comedy was very physical.
It's actually the style of the director. Berlanga is really known for his satire, for that kind of humor, and Kona, the script writer, was really known for his wit. He's very fast. He's very sharp. So the hair scene, as you were saying earlier, it's like the punishment that the teniente would give to the troops. No, it's like the major punishment. So it was actually it's a ridiculing, no, their form of punishment. So it was their form of disciplining the troops. So in my case, my favorite scene actually was the first part, where you see the panning of the trench, because I forgot to mention earlier when I was talking about the history of the Civil War. This movie took place in Aragon, and Aragon was a very important front in the Spanish Civil War because the nationalists wanted to siege Barcelona. But in order to get to Barcelona, they needed to siege Aragon first because it was in the way going to Barcelona. Once they get Barcelona, they would be able to cut off all supplies and all communication from Madrid, because Madrid to Barcelona goes through there. So it was a very important place that the Republicans had to defend. And the first scene where there was a panning of the trench and you see that sequence, no, with just one camera movement, showing everything that was happening. You can see many things happening at the same time, and it was like the everyday lives of the soldiers. You see people shaving, preparing their breakfast, and Berlanga said that he was actually in the trenches for 2 months. He didn't mention which side, but he said that he had an experience in when he was in the trenches. So that was the daily life that he knew when he was there, and that was what he wanted to reflect it. It was just people trying to get on with their daily lives. And my favorite part was when the trading of the cigarettes, when one said, oh, my family is in your side and your girlfriend is in my side. Oh, why don't we just change places, and you know, it doesn't matter. So it shows that, you know, people actually, maybe some of them really didn't believe in the war. They were just caught there and they wanted to change, to trade places. And then their superior said, oh, what are you talking about? There are two Spains, no, give him a slap. So it said everything in such a few words. It said a lot in such minimal scene and minimal language. So I don't. What about Patrick? What's your favorite scene?
I agree on both counts. The first one is the opening. I love the opening where so this vinyl, diba? Somebody puts it on the record on, and it's like a good morning song. And then we look at the trenches and people are in their underwear, like people doing Zoom meetings, wearing their top uniform and with their undergarments, right? So they're reading, it has a lot of the vibe of sort of MASH, where people who aren't doing combat are really just, you know, regular people, right? I mean, like they have to shave and they talk. But that part to me was really funny. And also I agree with Kristine that most of the scenes where they talk about swapping or exchanging, because there are a lot throughout the film where they sort of say they can swap, or that they know each other from across the line that divides them. Most of these scenes are funny, right? So the tobacco and the paper, the boyfriend and the girlfriend on the other side of the family. Toward the end, where they talk about, it's that kind of um, heartfelt moment where they talk about a friend who died of hunger. So these are key moments where the idea of like they could cross lines at any time. And of course the bathing scene where they could all that scene where they could all bathe in one spring, and there's no division. And in the horror house where they said everyone who's horny doesn't choose sides or something, or like fascists or communists, they all become horny. So these are like punchlines throughout the film. And they're punctuated according to this notion that you could exchange sides. But again, I'd like to highlight this idea that exchange sides, I think, in light of a war that has gone on. So I think if that was 1938 in the trenches, maybe they're really so tired, and you know they've been in war for a number of years, and if you're on the losing end, then maybe it will all feel so absurd, right? So, but what I found really interesting is exactly that, no? How they seem to that some of the jokes seem to suggest that they weren't fighting for anything. So that to me was really something I kept going back to. So could it be that that was really all? That was my other concern. Pam, you're saying something.
Yeah,
Right.
the reason why it was so funny, because they could easily negate what side they were on by saying, "Oh, when they asked them what troop are you," when
The
like
fourth.
the chaplain or the captain asked them what troop are you on, and they were hiding, they were pretended to be on the side of the nationalists. They invented like a name. I'm Donato. I'm in the fourth troop, and they kept repeating it. And I guess it shows that everyone in the film was after their own interests, really. Even when they were in trouble, even when they had a common goal of, let's say, getting the bull. One soldier wanted to look at his family's house. One soldier wanted to relive his life before when he was a matador. one soldier just wanted to eat or what, and they were all looking out for their own interest, and it was so easy for them to switch sides, to pretend to be on the side of the enemy just to get what they need.
Yeah, yeah. I agree. I think both ways we can see it both ways, right? And right now that Pam said it, I'm sort of drawn to that conclusion, because one way of looking at it from a positive side is that it was a kind of anti-war, pro-human,
Yeah.
very humanist film. But on the other end, it could be like really cynical and pessimistic, which Berlanga is known for. That he's not taking up sides. It's not really a humanist point of view, but rather it's like kind of exasperation about people's selfishness or something. And so we see this also in like the wearing of uniforms, right? So it's sort of misogynist and anti-LGBT bit where diba,
Oh yeah, there
the
was one
Maricon, right?
character.
Who made the
The,
uniforms, right? So that they could wear the uniform and pass off themselves as from the other side. So it could be that there's like only one Spain, the positive kind of narrative, but also they're hungry, they needed the food, so they would do anything. So and right now I'm more drawn to this idea that he was just cynical. I think the film was just cynical rather than anti-war per se. Isa, yeah.
Yeah, for the I also, I mean, it's very interesting what Christine is saying, that after the Civil War there was a national pact of let's forget it ever happened. So it's true, this sort of ambiguous what side is what. I think it really points to this war, which was really maybe just between a few groups, just between a few people that sort of took over daily life. Now, I wanted to ask Christine, how long did this war last, and how many people were killed? How many victims approximate?
The war lasted from 1936 to 1939, and it took away the lives of more than 500,000 people. So actually, cruelty was from both sides, both from the Republicans and the nationalist sides. So there were victims on both sides. And in the scene where you remember Mariano, he took a long way because he wanted to visit his house and his plantations, and he was so angry because it was his own troops that destroyed his plantation. So that was a really significant moment. No, how can my own troops do this to me, to my own plant? I'm on their side, but they're destroying my plantation. So it was the same. It's like brothers against brothers. You encounter families that are against you in two opposite sides. It was very cruel, and the Civil War was actually the, like what they say, the dress rehearsal for the Second World War, because it was the first modern war. Actually, they already had modern equipment, more modern tanks. The Republicans were helped by Russia and Mexico, while the nationalists were aided by Italy and Germany. So actually in the scenes it is very minimal, but you see all of these characters, in during the scene where the Republicans were trying to escape, and then all of a sudden a group of soldiers, they were marching like very fast. Those were actually the Italians. So you see that the like very subliminal scenes, but you see them. And I think the scene where the airplanes were flying over, I think it's also a symbol of Germany helping them. So you see many subliminal scenes in the movie, which suggest how the war happened. Also from the characters themselves, the priest, he's really like a typical portrayal of the church in that time, when after they have a meeting, and then they will drink jerez, and they would get the money from the alms of the people. So it's a very a portrait of them. Also the Marquez, he was only interested in that the Republicans would try to advance in their front, so that he can get his land in just one side. So all of these are it's a portrait of the people of Spain in that time.
I have
Sad
another
thing.
question, Christine. So the pact of forgetting, does it refer to forgetting the Franco years, or is it a pact to forget the Civil War years? Because I find this interesting, right? So in many places where, because of course a lot of people suffered under Franco, so I mean it is more important, I guess, from this side of history to remember the injustices under Franco, and maybe the war from 36 to 39 may be a little bit too far. So is the pact of forgetting trying to forget the Civil War or the Franco years?
It was a policy that meant to avoid anything that could awaken the memory of the past. So you can't celebrate like the anniversary of the start of the war, those things.
So both, right? So hi, Jessica.
Yeah. Sorry to have disappeared, as in, Zoom is in revolt. But I wanted to say that so we've been talking about La Vaquilla, which is set during the Spanish Civil War, and the Spanish Civil War was also a cultural moment because when it began, the international brigade from all over the world assembled in Spain to fight the war on the side of the Republicans. And so you had people like Ernest Hemingway, George Orwell, you had people like Pablo Picasso and Juan Miro creating art inspired by the Civil War. And it's interesting that some of the most arresting images of the Spanish Civil War were by the journalist Robert Capa, and Isa, as one of the main proponents of photography in the Philippines. Tell us about the Spanish Civil War in photography.
Well, war photography became a very, very big genre. So it started. I think the Spanish Civil War. Robert Capa was a young man when he went to Spain, and he took these very iconic photos. There's one of a soldier being shot as he's about to fall, and he's holding his rifle, and it created, I think, a lot of romantic ideas about photography and about war, and it fueled a lot of young men to go to the front, not just to fight, but to document. So war photography became very big, whether it was Second World War, the Vietnam War, and so on. One piece of trivia that I always like to mention is that the photography company Leica, it's just a German company, during the war was actually a Nazi company, and it was kept alive by making all sorts of other things other than cameras. So, but the Leica camera was like the weapon of choice for war photographers, and Capa was one of the first to really use this. Capa, his brother actually, Robert Capa's brother, Cornel Capa, created this even bigger myth. Well, not a myth, even a bigger idea about war photography by establishing an organization called the International Center of Photography in New York. And this is really, it's a school, foundation, museum that really pushes image making of humanitarian causes. So it's I cannot downplay the I guess the cultural importance of the Spanish Civil War to the larger use of photography and the use of images in media.
Yes, and since the Robert Capa photograph of the falling soldier is one of the most famous photographs in history, there have been controversies swirling around it, as in that it was faked, that it was posed, etc., etc.
Yes, yeah, it's a big deal. It even happens now. It's like poverty porn. I mean, poverty pictures. Where do you stand ethically between taking the picture and actually helping the person who's injured at the other end that you're shooting, you know. So whether he staged it or not, even the whole idea of staging photography has become a whole genre in itself. So
Right.
there's right now in the world, I would say, you know, majority of the photographs that we see are all staged. The selfie is staged, you know.
Right.
So it's something that you know, there's a lot of thought, a lot of ideas, a lot of discussion that can go into that. I also wanted to talk about the other artists who are making work, and you know, the most famous painting in Spain is Guernica.
Yeah.
And that's by Picasso, and it's a massive, you know, it's like a 15-foot painting, and it's essentially a bull that takes up the whole, you know, first third on the left. And I don't know, I mean, going back to the idea of Kristine, that, you know, a lot of people in Spain were caught flat-footed by this war. So you have a lot of artists who I don't know if they were on anyone's side, but they just started making art to show the effect of war on the people. So Miro, Picasso, of course, Dali perhaps, but you know, so it's and this has become some of the most important art to come out of Spain ever.
Right. Yes, and you brought up bullfighting, and of course we're talking in La Vaquilla about the bull as a symbol of Spain. I'd like to ask Kristine, in this age of greater awareness of animal rights and the environment and so on, is bullfighting still a thing in Spain? As in, do they still do it?
No, some regions have already abolished bullfighting. In Catalonia, for example, it's not allowed anymore. They converted their bull rings into other uses. It was traditionally seen as a sport and as an art, but obviously because of animal welfare concerns, many people right now, you know, we as a society, we have to evolve. We have to be concerned about these things already. And since the 80s, the bullfighting has lost popularity because of this. For me personally, I think I don't agree on bullfighting, because I think animals have rights as well, and we should look after their rights. Bullfighting for me is torture. It was like in the Roman times, when people, you know, were watching these spectacles of Christians and the gladiators, and that time it was accepted. So bullfighting at one moment in Spain, it was accepted. It was an art. It was a form of entertainment, but I think we have enough conscience right now to think that, you know, you're torturing an animal. It is not right. You know, you have the torero has the advantage because they were already like making the bull suffer by putting the banderillas. You know, the Mariano, Limeño in the movie, he was the banderillero. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the soldiers sent to capture the heifer is a former toreador, and he seems to be conflicted about his job, and so Patrick,
he was actually an amateur, not a torero. He was an amateur. He liked, yeah, but he wasn't a form of officially a torero. Many people like to do that as a pastime, as a hobby, but you know, they weren't really considered toreros.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Patrick. So there are the movie, although we're not exactly sure which side it's on, except for the victims, of course. There are some very clear targets, such as the church and then the land owning marquee. Yes. So
So I think the target really generally is the side of Franco and the nationalists, right? The Viva Franco, the bullfighting. I know Franco was a was a big fan of bullfighting and wanted it nationalized, right? So the fiesta, the Catholic Church, the landowners. So as I was mentioning earlier, so the idea that we're seeing this war from the side of the Republicans shows us that we can tip the narrative toward his feelings for the Republicans. And as I mentioned earlier, so even if the Republicans are also mocked in the film, they are after all the ones who are hungry and are losing. And this element really plays an important role in the overall premise of the film. That if war is absurd, then why is a situation where the losing soldiers don't have anything to eat and are trapped in the trenches, whereas the people there are celebrating, they're eating. That's why a funny scene where they said, we like all these misadventures have happened already. We have to eat, right? So
Yes.
and so they go to the fiesta and they eat. So this to me shows how Berlanga's heart was going out to the people who were suffering in the war, and the losing end was the losing team or the group. The compassion was somehow there. But while you weren't here, Jessica, we were saying also, could it be that it was all like cynicism, that in the end, because he didn't pick sides, the humor was really very cynical. So it's very different in terms of like comedy, like Dolphy, for example, Isa was mentioning earlier, but the Dolphy comedies were all happy ending movies.
Yes, of course.
In this case, like it was really this really somber ending, and he didn't pick sides. So it was really kind of pessimistic. So it could be not an anti-war film in which he picked the side of humanity, but rather it was kind of like resignation or frustration.
Yes, and do we have questions from the audience? So while we wait for questions from the audience, you can also tell that the film is a product of its time, the mid-80s, because there are characters who are the butt of the jokes who would not be the butt of the jokes in a more enlightened time, such as the effeminate man who was made the comic foil in many sequences. And so wait, hang on. From the audience.
Wait, can I just answer that, Jessica? Because
the
film was shot in the 80s, but actually the script was done in the 50s. So I think it's an important matter to consider.
Okay.
So if it was written in the 50s, which war was it? Okay, so it's still now World War II. It was originally the Spanish Civil War, right?
Yeah. It's the same subject,
50s,
but
okay.
it was written in the 50s, but they weren't able to shoot it in the 50s, so they did it in the 80s.
Okay.
And we have a question here. Buñuel and Almodovar are famous in Spain and the rest of the world, while Berlanga doesn't seem to have the international recognition that his compatriots have. Why do you think this is so?
I think Berlanga's humor is very Spanish. I think he speaks a lot of things that can only be understood in Spain, and it would be hard to understand outside of Spain. So whilst Almodovar and Buñuel, they are more, I don't know, maybe their humor is more international, or in the case of Almodovar. So I don't know. I think it's because of that, because Berlanga deals with Spain, the topicos in Spain. So he can only be understood here. I don't know, maybe others.
The cultural references are very specific, right?
Yeah, and I wanted to ask Patrick, before we wind up, well, the title of your book is The End of National Cinema. What do you mean by national cinema?
Okay, that's a great question. So the book is it looks into the first decade of the 21st century, Philippine cinema, first decade of the 21st century. But I do it by going back to the ways that scholars and critics have written national cinema. So for example, from this point of view, this is what national cinema means. And what happens if you look at this concept and apply it to 21st century digital filmmaking. So my notion there of end is really, it has multiple meanings. End as in, it has boundaries. There's a kind of terminal element where you can't apply old definitions of national cinema today in the digital world. But there's also a notion of end in the sense of purpose, which suggests that we cannot discard simply the notion of national cinema, but we must renew its purpose. So in the book, I talk about both how people have defined national cinema as culturally Filipino, but also I talk about the politics and economics about the nation, right? So it's not all culture, but it's also politics and economics, which I sort of smuggled in when we talk about national cinema. We talk about distribution abroad. We talk about being joining film festivals. Isa was mentioning this term poverty porn. So how is that related to this notion of the national? So I look at all these angles and problematize national cinema from these different perspectives.
So this factor into the question we were discussing as to why Berlanga seems to be better known in Spain, while Buñuel and Almodovar are more viewed as international.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for saying that. And since you mentioned the book, no, so I have a chapter there where I discuss Philippine action movies and comedies, and this is really maybe true in most countries, but there's a special element that it applies to the Philippine situation, and that is exactly that. Some filmmakers and movies speak to the people or the bayan or the grassroots of where they come from. And I think Berlanga's humor and the specificity of his narrative is about that. The Spanish people will get it, will laugh, will understand all the references. And it may not necessarily translate. So the Dolphy reference of Isa earlier, I think is the same. I mean, we don't know of Dolphy films being exported or joining film festivals abroad. But I mean, Dolphy's the king of comedy. Like whatever he does, so funny for us. And this is really, really important because a lot of what we have remembered as national cinema are films that not many people have seen, not many Filipinos have seen. And yet, films that people have seen are not really remembered as like national films, right? So I guess this applies directly to the question of Berlanga and Almodovar and Buñuel. We remember Buñuel and Almodovar as Spanish filmmakers because we're not from Spain, right? So these are markers of their cosmopolitan international identities. But how much the Spanish people like Buñuel, for example, will be another subject, right? So I don't know if Almodovar. I think Almodovar is popular either way, but Buñuel, right? So you would have one who's known elsewhere and one who's known by his own people, and this I think is very important in the Civil War question, right? Because you need to speak to the people.
Yes, and I want to ask Pam, because Pam is from the new breed of independent filmmakers, and the ones who are best known on the festival circuit and outside the Philippines are also barely known in their own country. Pam?
Yeah.
So does this cause any tension for you? As in, when you make a film, do you have to think this is for the Filipino audience, or this is for the international audience, or the festival audience?
Well, ideally, when you make a film, you don't really think about those things. I mean, the idea of creating something, you can't really control who will appreciate your film or not. Although, admittedly, because I work for television too. That's what I do for a living. Actually, I direct for TV, and at the same time, I do films that nobody has ever, most people haven't seen because it hasn't had like any commercial success here.
Theatrical
But
exhibition.
so I guess it's working. Is knowing, being on both sides of this makes you think that sometimes you can't really have everything. you can't really have both to be ang galing what Patrick said, that parang you can't have a film that's really known internationally yet at the same time be well known among with the people or with the masses. It's hard to have that balance. It's like speaking two different languages.
Right. And so I'd like to ask Isa about a similar subject because in recent years, we keep hearing about how there is an art boom in the Philippines. But is this art boom just, Filipinos taking a greater interest in art by Filipinos, or is there more foreign interest in Filipino art?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. Filipinos are very, very much, we like art. Whether it's good art or bad art, we like art.
Basta they like it, yeah.
We have a specific, our aesthetic is super, it's there. And we have opinions that we feel strongly about the stuff that we like and we don't like. So visual art has really, I guess, had a good run. I would say the last 10 years. There's, when I started Silver Lens in 2004, you could count the number of commercial contemporary galleries in two hands. Now there are maybe 80 to 100
Wow.
just within Metro Manila. So, and this is because it's become something that's quite trendy and popular. Now, of course, we all know that there's good art, and then there's, then there are just people who copy or who follow the trends. So to answer your question, yes, Filipinos like to buy art and they do support artists that are good. They also support artists who are not good. And it's the same, it's the same in the film industry, it's the same.
Yes.
And then to talk about some success that Filipino art has reached outside. Also, yes, we have reached. We've had artists who have been included in big shows like the Venice Biennale main section. We have artists who are constantly being invited to do exhibitions outside, who are collected by museums, who have collectors, outside of the Philippines. In my case, in our gallery's case, we really try to find the unicorns. I call them the unicorns because they are successful here and successful outside. And that's very, very, it's a unicorn. How many unicorns can you find, right? But we invest quite a lot in really pushing artists who we feel have singular voices and who have discipline and who have, who have this practice, a work ethic, and who are good enough to be able to be put out there and to stand the scrutiny of the rest of the world, So yes, the answer to your question is yes and yes.
Yes. So, right now, everything is at a standstill, but we all hope that Filipino film, the Philippine visual arts, Philippine photography continues to thrive as it has begun to before everything shut down. But anyway, I'm told that we have to say goodbye, although we can keep talking for the next 3 days. So I'd like to thank our guests for joining us this afternoon, and super apologies for disappearing, technical problems. So Pam, any last words?
About the film. I'm not sure. Can someone go first before me? I don't want to say. About the film, I don't know what. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Yeah, just general goodbye and things that you want people to remember.
No, well, thank you for having me here and
Thanks for joining
for
us.
giving me the chance to like watch this film by Berlanga. And yeah, I guess I would have to agree with the film's statement that war is absurd and war is stupid, and at the end of it, at the end of everything, it's really uh, the people, the innocent um, people, the civilians that are the victims. At the end of it, nothing good comes out of
Yes.
it.
Yeah. So Kristine, thank you for joining us from Spain. Kristine?
Yes,
Yes.
thank you. Thank you to Instituto Cervantes for this initiative for making Spanish films available to everyone. Thank you especially to Jose Font for this invitation to have me here. And I would like to invite everyone to pay attention to the closing song of the movie because it's a very beautiful song and I think it's worth listening to the lyrics. The song is called La hija de Juan Simón. And it's a song about a grave digger, the only grave digger in the village who buries his own daughter. And the song actually reminded me of the actual situation right now with the health pandemic because in Spain for a while, we can't have burials. I don't know if in the Philippines is the same. So it's very sad already to have someone pass away, but it's even sadder to that
No
people
funeral.
can say goodbye. Yeah, that people can
Right.
say goodbye to their loved ones. So that song is really very significant at this moment in the pandemic. So I would like to invite everyone if they can listen to the song. It's a very beautiful song.
Yes, and remember that La Vaquilla, the heifer, is showing until 2 in the morning. So Patrick, any final thoughts before we wind up?
Okay. Yun. So thank you for having us. And just to add to what Pam was saying, no, so I'd like to emphasize that other part. If war is absurd, then we also ought not to forget. I think this notion of forgetting, a pact of forgetting, we can't reconcile with our past if we forget it, right? So this is especially true for places that have suffered for a lot and for people who have been victimized unjustly by, so but if we forget, then what is left of us? So these references to the arts that were made, the photographs, the films, these are very important. These are very important testaments to to posterity, to the next generations who will remember and say, we will not do that again. We will not allow that to happen again.
Yes. Thank you for putting it that way. And Isa?
Yes, thank you very much to Instituto Cervantes, Jessica, and to the other, our members on this panel. I can't help but think of how important history is and how even if our current history has yet to be written or is constantly being rewritten, it behooves us individually to really take responsibility for what the truth is. And I think that this film, it really opened my eyes to, these so many connections. We already know that we have many connections with Spain, but this idea of war, whether it's something that happens overtly or something that happens, physically with people fighting, it's really something that we should be we should speak up against.
Yes.
And we must remember always where we came from, who we are, why we are doing what we are doing. So with that, thank you to Jose for this unexpected invitation.
Yes, thank you very much for joining us. And I'd like to thank the audience for watching Clásicos Contigo in the last 5 weeks and for joining us at Cineclub Película. Remember, you can watch La Vaquilla until 2 a.m. So, thank you and maraming salamat po.